You wake up tired, not from lack of sleep. You slept enough. It's a different kind of tired, the kind that settles into your bones and stays there, heavy and familiar. And somewhere, in a part of yourself you don't like to look at, you notice something strange. You're not actually trying to feel better. You're doing the opposite. You're picking at the wound, replaying the conversation that hurt you, returning to the relationship that's destroying you, staying in the situation you know is bad for you. And the strangest part isn't that you're suffering. The strangest part is that something in you seems to want it. If that sounds familiar, stay here, because today we're going to look at one of the most confusing patterns in the human psyche, the strange, paradoxical, almost inexplicable tendency to return to our own pain, to choose what hurts us, to sabotage the very things we say we want. This isn't about being weak. It isn't about being broken. It's about understanding why the mind sometimes mistakes suffering for home. There's a term in psychology that captures something essential about this pattern. Sigmund Freud called it repetition compulsion, the unconscious drive to recreate painful experiences from our past, even when they cause us suffering in the present. He first described it in his 1920 work, Beyond the Pleasure Principle, where he observed something that puzzled him deeply. People weren't simply seeking pleasure and avoiding pain, as he'd originally theorized. They were doing something stranger. They were returning again and again to situations that hurt them. They were choosing their wounds. Think about what that means. The mind, this extraordinary instrument that evolved to protect us, to help us survive, to steer us away from danger, was actively steering people back toward their pain. Veterans who had experienced the horrors of war would dream about those horrors, night after night, forcing themselves to relive what they desperately wanted to forget. Children who had been hurt would create games that reenacted their trauma. Adults who had grown up in chaos would find themselves as if magnetically drawn to chaotic relationships, chaotic environments, chaotic lives. The pleasure principle couldn't explain this. Something else was going on. Freud theorized that this compulsion served a purpose, that by returning to the trauma, the psyche was attempting to master it, to gain control over what had once made it feel powerless. There was something almost heroic in this view. The mind as a wounded warrior, going back to the battlefield, trying to win a fight it had already lost. But there was also something deeply tragic in it, because these reenactments rarely led to mastery. Instead, traumatized people often led traumatized lives, stuck in a loop they couldn't see, let alone escape. The attempt to master the past became a prison built from the materials of that very past. Later psychologists expanded on this idea in important ways. Otto Fennekel, writing in the mid-20th century, identified two distinct kinds of neurotic repetition. There was the active form, where someone might deliberately seek out situations that echo their original trauma. The person who grew up with an alcoholic parent and then marries an alcoholic. The person who was abandoned in childhood and then pushes everyone away until they leave. The person who was criticized relentlessly and then seeks out partners who do the same. And there was the passive form, where someone clings to familiar but painful patterns, simply because the unknown seems more frightening than the known suffering. They stay not because they're choosing pain, but because they can't imagine anything else. Erik Erikson called it destiny neurosis, the way some people seem to unconsciously arrange for variations of an original theme they've never learned to overcome or live with. They make the same mistakes over and over, not because they're stupid, not because they're masochistic in any simple sense, but because something in them keeps returning to unfinished business, keeps trying to rewrite a story that's already been written. It's as if they believe that this time, if they just play it right, the ending will be different. But it never is. The core conflictual relationship theme, as later researchers called it, describes how people carry core wishes about relationships that lead them to behave in ways that engender particular responses from others. Responses that conform with previous experiences. In other words, we don't just passively attract the same kinds of relationships. We actively create the conditions for them. We behave in ways that pull certain responses from others. Responses that feel terrible, but also feel familiar, feel right, feel like confirmation of something we've always known. But here's where it gets more interesting and more troubling. Because the compulsion to repeat isn't just about trying to master the past. Sometimes it's about something simpler and more devastating. The past has become who we are. It has fused with our identity so completely that we can't imagine ourselves without it. There's a concept in attachment theory that helps illuminate this. John Bowlby, the British psychiatrist who pioneered our understanding of how early relationships shape us, observed that children form what he called internal working models, mental blueprints of what relationships are supposed to look like, based on their earliest experiences with caregivers. These models aren't just ideas or memories, they're deep templates that shape perception, expectation, and behavior for a lifetime. If those early experiences were warm and consistent, the child develops what's called a secure attachment style. They expect relationships to be safe. They expect their needs to be met. They expect love to feel good. They can tolerate closeness without suffocating and distance without panicking. They can ask for what they need and trust that asking won't lead to punishment or abandonment. But if those early experiences were inconsistent, frightening, or neglectful, the child develops an insecure attachment style. And here's the crucial part. These children don't just learn that relationships are unsafe. They learn that relationships are supposed to feel unsafe. The chaos, the unpredictability, the pain, this becomes normal. It becomes the water they swim in. It becomes the only version of love they know. It becomes home. Mary Ainsworth, who worked with Bowlby and developed the famous strange situation experiment for studying attachment in infants, identified several patterns of insecure attachment. There's anxious attachment, where children become clingy and desperate, unable to be soothed even when the caregiver returns. There's avoidant attachment, where children learn to suppress their needs and appear independent, because expressing need led only to rejection. And there's disorganized attachment, perhaps the most damaging of all, where children develop contradictory strategies because the caregiver was simultaneously the source of fear and the only available source of comfort. How do you run to safety when safety itself is dangerous? These patterns, established in the first years of life, tend to persist into adulthood. The anxiously attached child becomes the adult who texts obsessively, who reads abandonment into every delayed response, who clings tighter the more their partner pulls away. The avoidantly attached child becomes the adult who can't let anyone get close, who leaves before being left, who dismisses their own needs so thoroughly they barely know they have them. And the disorganized child becomes the adult who wants intimacy desperately but panics when it arrives, who pushes people away and then feels devastated when they go, who can never quite settle into either closeness or distance. This is where the addiction to suffering begins to make a terrible kind of sense. If your nervous system was calibrated in childhood to expect pain, then pain feels familiar, and familiar to the deep, ancient parts of the brain means safe. It doesn't matter that the conscious mind knows the relationship is toxic. It doesn't matter that you can see clearly that you're destroying yourself. The unconscious mind isn't operating on logic. It's operating on pattern recognition. And the pattern it recognizes, the pattern it's been trained to seek out, is the pattern of your original wound. The Buddhist monk Thich Nhat Hanh captured this paradox with devastating precision when he observed that people have a hard time letting go of their suffering because, out of a fear of the unknown, they prefer suffering that is familiar. Read that again. They prefer suffering that is familiar, not because they enjoy it, not because they want to hurt, but because the unknown, even if it might be better, feels more dangerous than the pain they already know. This preference for familiar suffering isn't a character flaw. It's not weakness. It's not a failure of willpower. It's a survival mechanism gone haywire. Your nervous system evolved to keep you alive. And one of the ways it does this is by creating strong associations between certain stimuli and certain outcomes. If you touched fire and got burned, your brain learned to avoid fire. Simple, effective, life-saving. But what happens when the fire was your primary caregiver? What happens when the source of pain was also the source of survival, of food, of shelter, of whatever scraps of love were available? You can't avoid your own parent the way you'd avoid a hot stove. You need them. Your survival depends on them. So instead, your brain does something remarkable and terrible. It learns to associate love with pain. It learns that this is what love feels like. The fire becomes home. Now fast forward 20 or 30 years. You're an adult. You have choices you didn't have as a child. And you're in a relationship with someone who treats you the way your parent treated you. Inconsistently, coldly, sometimes cruelly. Your friends tell you to leave. Part of you knows you should, but here's what's strange. It feels right. Not good. Not healthy, but right. Like a key fitting into a lock. Like a song you've heard before. Like coming home. The neuroscience of trauma helps explain why this happens, why these patterns are so resistant to change, even when we can see them clearly. Bessel van der Kolk, one of the world's foremost experts on traumatic stress, has spent over 3 decades studying how trauma reshapes the brain and body. His work, synthesized in his influential book, The Body Keeps the Score, suggests that traumatic experiences aren't just stored as memories. They're stored as physiological states. The fear, the hypervigilance, the sense of danger, these become encoded in the nervous system itself. The body literally keeps the score of what has happened to it. When you've spent years in a certain physiological state, years with your nervous system on high alert, years with cortisol flooding your bloodstream, years with your muscles tensed for danger, that state starts to feel normal. Anything else feels wrong. Peace feels suspicious. Calm feels like the moment before the storm. Love without pain feels like a trap, like something too good to be true, like a setup for an even greater fall. This is why people who grew up in chaos often feel uncomfortable with peace. This is why someone who was constantly criticized might feel suspicious of genuine praise. This is why the survivor of a volatile relationship might find a kind, stable partner boring, or too nice, or somehow lacking the spark that makes it feel real. Their nervous system has been calibrated for storm. Calm feels like the absence of something essential. It feels like waiting for the other shoe to drop. It feels like not being fully alive. Stephen Porges, who developed polyvagal theory, offers another lens for understanding this. According to Porges, our nervous system is constantly scanning the environment, for signs of safety or danger through a process he calls neuroception. This scanning happens automatically below the level of conscious awareness. And crucially, what our nervous system tags as safe or dangerous depends not on objective reality, but on what we've learned to associate with safety and danger. For someone who grew up in a calm, predictable environment, calm and predictability signal safety. The nervous system relaxes. Social engagement becomes possible. But for someone who grew up in chaos, calm can actually feel threatening, because in their experience, calm was often the precursor to an explosion. Their nervous system learned that the quiet moments were the dangerous ones, the ones where you had to stay most vigilant. So when they encounter genuine safety, their body doesn't know what to do with it. It feels wrong. It triggers a kind of internal alarm. There's extensive research that supports this phenomenon. Studies on stress physiology show that people who experienced chronic stress in childhood often have dysregulated cortisol responses as adults. Their bodies don't respond to stress the way bodies are supposed to respond. They might feel weirdly calm in crisis situations that would send most people into panic, because crisis is their baseline, their comfort zone. And conversely, they might feel anxious and uncomfortable in situations that most people would find relaxing. Their stress response system has been converted. Chaos registers as normal. Peace registers as threat. This helps explain one of the most baffling patterns in human behavior. Why some people seem to create drama wherever they go. Why they can't sustain a peaceful relationship or a stable job or a calm inner life. Why the moment things start going well, something happens to derail it. It's not that they want the drama, at least not consciously. It's that their nervous system is addicted to it. The heightened arousal, the rush of adrenaline, the constant alertness, this is the physiological state they know. This is how their body learned to feel alive. There's even research suggesting that people raised in high-stress environments may have higher baseline levels of cortisol, the stress hormone. Their bodies are literally primed for danger, even when there's no danger present. And when the stress isn't there, when things are calm and peaceful, their bodies don't know what to do. They might feel restless, agitated, like something is wrong, even when nothing is wrong. They might describe feeling bored, when what they really mean is that their nervous system is understimulated compared to what it's used to. This is why someone might leave a good relationship because it's too easy, or sabotage a job that's going well because it's not challenging enough. What they're really saying, though they might not know it, is that their nervous system doesn't recognize peace. It doesn't register as real. It registers as the absence of something, the absence of the familiar stress that tells their body they're alive and alert. Some researchers describe this as an addiction to one's own stress hormones. When you've grown up, flooded with cortisol and adrenaline, your body adapts to those levels. They become your normal. And when the levels drop, you might actually experience something like withdrawal. You feel flat, empty, depressed. You feel like something is missing. And unconsciously, you start seeking out situations that will restore those familiar hormone levels. Situations that will make you feel alive again, even if that aliveness comes with a price. When you've been conditioned to equate peace with danger, you'll unconsciously create the chaos you're trying to avoid. You'll pick fights. You'll miss deadlines. You'll choose partners who keep you off balance. You'll sabotage the job interview, the relationship, the opportunity, not because you want to fail, but because failure and chaos feel like home. And home, however painful, feels like survival. But there's another layer to this, and it might be the most important one. Because addiction to suffering isn't just about what's familiar to the nervous system. It's about who we believe we are. It's about identity. Researchers at Tel Aviv University recently conducted a groundbreaking series of 8 separate studies on what they call the tendency for interpersonal victimhood, a personality construct that describes an enduring feeling that the self is a victim across different kinds of relationships. What they found was striking and illuminating. People with a high tendency for interpersonal victimhood displayed several consistent characteristics. First, they had an intense need for their victimhood to be recognized by others, a need for validation of their suffering that could never quite be satisfied. Second, they engaged in what the researchers called moral elitism. They saw themselves as morally superior to those who had wronged them, as purer, as more innocent. Third, they had significant difficulty empathizing with the suffering of others because their own victimhood consumed so much psychological space. And fourth, they spent enormous mental energy ruminating on their past injuries, replaying them, analyzing them, keeping them fresh. But here's what's most important about this research. The tendency for interpersonal victimhood wasn't simply a response to having been victimized. Some people who had experienced severe trauma didn't develop this mindset, while others who had experienced relatively minor setbacks did. What seemed to matter wasn't the objective severity of what someone had suffered, but how they had woven that suffering into their sense of self, whether victimhood had become their identity. The researchers also found something else significant. People high in this tendency had what they called a negative attribution bias. They were more likely to interpret ambiguous situations as hostile or threatening. If someone didn't return their call, it wasn't because they were busy. It was because they were being deliberately hurtful. If a friend seemed distracted, it wasn't because they had something on their mind. It was because they didn't care. Every neutral event got filtered through the lens of victimhood, becoming further evidence for the story of being wronged. This creates a self-reinforcing cycle. The more you interpret the world through the lens of victimhood, the more evidence you find to support that interpretation. And the more evidence you find, the more the interpretation gets strengthened. Your brain is literally looking for confirmation of what it already believes, and it finds it everywhere. The world starts to look like a hostile place, full of people who are out to hurt you, because that's the story you're telling yourself. And confirmation bias makes sure you notice every piece of data that supports it. There's also an interesting relationship between interpersonal victimhood and memory. The researchers found that people high in this tendency were more likely to remember negative interactions and less likely to remember positive ones. Their memories were biased toward hurt and harm, toward times they were wronged and overlooked, toward evidence for the prosecution in the case they were building against the world. Even their past was being shaped to support the story of victimhood. This is the crux of it. Suffering can become an identity. It can become the organizing principle around which an entire personality is constructed. It can become the lens through which every experience is interpreted, the story that explains everything. And once that happens, giving up the suffering feels like giving up the self. Think about what this means psychologically. If your suffering is who you are, if your story of victimhood is what makes you special, what explains your failures, what connects you to others, what gives you a sense of moral clarity in a confusing world, then what happens when the suffering goes away? Who are you without it? What's your story? What's your excuse? For some people, these questions are more terrifying than the suffering itself. At least when you're suffering, you know who you are. You're the person who was hurt. You're the person who was wronged. You're the one who has it harder than everyone else. You have a clear role in the drama of life. Take away the suffering, and you're faced with a void. You're faced with the terrifying freedom of being no one in particular. You're faced with having to build an identity from scratch without the scaffolding of your wounds. The psychologist Richard Schwartz, who developed internal family systems therapy in the 1980s, offers a framework for understanding this that's both compassionate and illuminating. In his model, the mind isn't a single unified entity. It's a system of parts, each with its own perspective, its own agenda, its own fears and desires. These parts develop to serve important functions, but they can become extreme and rigid in response to trauma. When someone experiences trauma, certain parts take on extreme roles. Some become what Schwartz calls managers, parts that try to keep the person functional and safe by controlling their inner and outer environments. These might be the perfectionist part that demands impossible standards, the critic part that tears you down before anyone else can, the caretaker part that focuses on everyone's needs but your own. Managers are trying to prevent pain by maintaining constant vigilance and control. Then there are the exiles, wounded parts that carry the pain, shame, and fear from past experiences. These parts hold the memories that are too painful to face, the feelings that are too overwhelming to feel. They're called exiles because the manager parts work constantly to keep them buried, locked away, silenced. The system fears that if these exiles were to surface, their pain would be unmanageable. And finally, there are firefighters, parts that react when the exiles break through despite the manager's efforts. Firefighters are about immediate relief, about putting out emotional fires at any cost. They might turn to substances, to binge eating, to self-harm, to explosive anger, anything to escape the pain that's threatening to surface. They're not thinking about long-term consequences. They just want the pain to stop. Now, here's what's crucial. All of these parts, even the ones that seem most destructive, genuinely believe they're helping. The part of you that picks fights when things get too intimate, it's trying to prevent you from getting hurt by creating distance before the inevitable abandonment. The part that sabotages your success, it's trying to protect you from the responsibility, scrutiny, and potential jealousy that comes with achievement. The part that returns you again and again to people who treat you badly, it's trying to keep you in familiar territory, away from the unknown dangers of new kinds of relationships. These parts developed for a reason. When you were a child and had no power, these strategies made a kind of sense. If your parent was unpredictable, learning to anticipate their moods and avoid triggering them was survival. If showing need was punished, learning to suppress need was survival. If the only way to get attention was to be in crisis, learning to create crisis was survival. The problem is that these parts don't know you've grown up. They're still operating as if you're a helpless child in an overwhelming world. They're still trying to protect you from dangers that no longer exist, using strategies that have long outlived their usefulness. They're frozen in time, fighting yesterday's battles. It's like having a security system that was installed when you lived in a dangerous neighborhood, and it's still running on high alert, even though you've moved to a safe place years ago. The alarms keep going off at nothing. The locks keep clicking shut. The part of you that's monitoring for danger never gets the message that the danger has passed. This is why insight alone isn't enough. You can understand perfectly well that your father isn't going to hit you anymore. He might even be dead, and still flinch when someone raises their voice. You can know intellectually that this partner is nothing like your ex, and still feel the same fear in your body when they're 5 minutes late coming home. The protective parts aren't listening to your rational mind. They're operating on their own timeline, responding to threats that existed decades ago. Working with these parts requires something different from logical argument. It requires building a relationship with them. It requires understanding what they're afraid of and helping them see that the world has changed. It requires earning their trust, which can take time because they've been doing their job of protecting you for years, and they're not going to stop just because you tell them to. But there's another part at play in the addiction to suffering, and it's perhaps the darkest one, the part that believes you deserve it. Freud wrote about moral masochism, the tendency to seek punishment, often unconsciously, as a way of atoning for guilt. He distinguished this from sexual masochism, noting that moral masochism was about satisfying an unconscious need for punishment, a need to balance some internal moral ledger. Later research has confirmed that guilt really does seem to motivate self-punishment in striking ways. In one remarkable study, published in the journal Emotion, researchers Yoel Inbar and colleagues found that people who wrote about a past guilt-inducing event were more likely to inflict intense electric shocks on themselves than people who wrote about feeling sad or about neutral experiences. Even more striking, the stronger the shocks they gave themselves, the more their feelings of guilt were alleviated. They were literally shocking themselves to feel better. This is profound and disturbing. It suggests that the mind has a kind of internal ledger, a moral accounting system that demands balance. When we feel we've done something wrong, or when we feel fundamentally wrong in ourselves, there's a part of us that seeks punishment to settle the debt. And if no one else is going to punish us, we'll do it ourselves. We'll arrange for our own suffering. We'll sabotage our own success. We'll ensure that we don't get more than we deserve, where what we deserve has been set impossibly low. For people who grew up being told they were bad, that they were too much, that they were the cause of their family's problems, this internal accounting system can be devastating. They carry a core belief that they're guilty of something, even if they can't name what it is. Their very existence feels like a transgression, and this belief creates a kind of gravitational pull towards suffering. Success feels undeserved. Happiness feels stolen. Love feels like something that will inevitably be taken away once the other person realizes who they really are. So they sabotage. They create the punishment before it can be inflicted from outside. They confirm their worst beliefs about themselves over and over, because confirmation, even painful confirmation, is more bearable than uncertainty. At least if they destroy it themselves, they controlled the destruction. At least they saw it coming. At least they weren't surprised. This is the terrible logic of self-sabotage. It feels like control. It feels like agency. It feels like choosing your fate rather than having it chosen for you. But it's a false agency, a way of arranging to lose that masquerades as power. It's the illusion of control, maintained at the cost of everything that matters. Martin Seligman, the psychologist who pioneered the research on learned helplessness in the 1960s, discovered something important about this pattern. In his famous experiments with Stephen Meyer, he found that animals exposed to inescapable shocks would eventually stop trying to escape, even when escape became possible. They had learned that their actions didn't matter. They had learned that they were helpless, even when the situation changed. Even when the door was open, they would just lie there and take the shock. But here's what's most interesting. Subsequent neuroscience research, conducted decades later by Meyer himself, revealed that Seligman's original theory had it backwards. Passivity, it turns out, isn't learned. It's the default state. What's learned is the belief that you can affect your environment, that your actions matter, that you have some control over what happens to you. This sense of agency develops through experience, through repeatedly discovering that when you do something, something changes. What this means is that helplessness isn't something the traumatized mind learns. It's something the healthy mind unlearns. It's what we all start with in infancy, when we're completely dependent and powerless. Most of us gradually develop a sense of efficacy through experiences of successful action. When we cry, someone comes. When we reach, we grasp. When we try, we sometimes succeed. These experiences build the neural pathways that support a sense of agency. But for people who grew up in environments where nothing they did seemed to matter, where punishment came regardless of behavior, where affection was arbitrary and unpredictable, where the rules kept changing and there was no way to win, that sense of efficacy never fully develops. The neural pathways that support agency never get strengthened. The default state of helplessness is never overwritten. So they carry a deep, often unconscious belief that they can't really change anything, that their efforts don't matter, that they're fundamentally at the mercy of forces beyond their control. And from this belief, suffering starts to seem not only inevitable, but almost comfortable. If you're going to suffer anyway, there's a strange relief in at least choosing the form your suffering takes. If you can't win, you can at least control how you lose. This is one of the cruelest tricks the traumatized mind plays on itself. It takes the genuine helplessness of the past and projects it onto the present and future. It says, because you couldn't escape then, you can't escape now. Because your efforts didn't matter before, they don't matter anymore. Because love hurt you once, it will always hurt you. Because you were trapped, you are trapped. And the tragedy is that this belief can become self-fulfilling. Because when you believe you're helpless, you stop trying. When you stop trying, nothing changes. And when nothing changes, your belief in your helplessness is confirmed. You've created evidence for your own limiting belief. You've proven yourself right at the cost of everything. But let's go deeper still, because there's another dimension to the addiction to suffering that we haven't fully explored. The social and relational dimension. Suffering, it turns out, can be a powerful form of connection. It can be a language. It can be an identity that links you to others. Think about the bonds that form between people who have shared trauma. Think about the intimacy that comes from showing someone your wounds. Think about how being vulnerable, being seen in your pain, can create a closeness that being seen in your strength never could. There's something about shared suffering that feels like true connection, like really knowing someone, like breaking through the surface. There's a reason why trauma bonds are so powerful, why people who've suffered together feel connected in ways that people who've been happy together often don't. Suffering breaks down the facades we normally maintain. It strips away the pretense. It shows us who we really are when everything else is gone. And there's an intimacy in that nakedness, in being seen at your most raw and undefended. For some people, suffering is the primary way they know how to connect. It's the language they speak fluently. It's the currency they trade in. When someone asks how they're doing, they don't know how to answer, except by detailing what's wrong. When they're in a group, they don't know how to claim space except by revealing their struggles. When they want to feel close to someone, they don't know how to get there except through shared pain. This pattern often shows up in conversations. Notice how some people can only relate to others through problems. If you share good news, they immediately shift the conversation back to difficulties. If you're happy, they seem uncomfortable, uncertain how to engage. But mention a struggle, and suddenly they're present, attentive, connected. This isn't malice. It's a relational style that was learned early and reinforced over decades. Sometimes this manifests as competitive suffering, the tendency to respond to someone else's pain by sharing pain of your own, often escalating the intensity. You think that's bad, Let me tell you what happened to me. This can look like empathy, and sometimes it is. But sometimes it's a way of claiming relational space, of saying, I belong here too. I suffer too. Don't forget about me. The currency of connection is suffering, and everyone's trying to prove they have enough to buy a seat at the table. This isn't manipulation, though it can look like it from the outside. It's simply that suffering has become synonymous with intimacy. The logic goes something like this. If I show you my wounds, you'll see the real me. If I'm okay, if I'm functioning, if I'm succeeding, then I'm performing a false self that isn't really me. My authentic self is the suffering self. My truth is my pain. And there's often a reinforcement history behind this. Many people learned in childhood that their needs would only be met when something was seriously wrong. The parent who was otherwise distant or critical might become warm and attentive when the child was sick or hurt. The family that was otherwise chaotic might rally together in a crisis. The message internalized, I am only worthy of care when I am suffering. I am only visible when I am in pain. I only matter when something is wrong. So suffering becomes a strategy, not a conscious manipulative strategy, but an unconscious adaptation to an environment where pain was the only reliable path to connection. And like all unconscious adaptations, it persists long after the original environment has changed. The adult still believes, somewhere deep down, that they need to be suffering to deserve love. They still believe that wellness would make them invisible. There's also something called secondary gain to consider, the hidden benefits that come from being in a suffering role. These might include attention from others, excuse from responsibilities, a sense of moral superiority, or freedom from having to take risks. If you're suffering, people feel bad for you. They don't expect as much from you. They don't hold you to the same standards. They give you more leeway, more patience, more care. In a way, suffering can become a kind of social insurance policy. It protects you from the demands that come with being perceived as okay. None of this is to say that suffering is chosen in any simple sense, or that people are being deliberately manipulative. The secondary gains of suffering are almost never consciously sought, but they are real, and they create invisible reinforcement systems that can keep people locked in patterns they genuinely want to escape. Every time suffering leads to care, every time pain leads to connection, every time struggle leads to excuse, the pattern is strengthened. So we have this tangled web, the repetition compulsion, driving us back to familiar pain. The attachment system that learned love equals hurt. The nervous system calibrated for chaos and suspicious of peace. The identity built around victimhood. The moral accounting that demands punishment. The learned helplessness that says nothing can change. The relational patterns that connect suffering to intimacy. The secondary gains that invisibly reinforce the whole system. No wonder it's hard to escape. No wonder the patterns persist even when we can see them. No wonder the way out feels so unclear. But here's the thing, and this is important. Recognizing these patterns doesn't mean you're trapped in them. In fact, recognition is the first and most crucial step toward freedom. The reason repetition compulsion has power is precisely because it's unconscious. You can't fight an enemy you can't see. You can't change a pattern you don't recognize. But once you start to see it, once you catch yourself in the act of choosing pain, of sabotaging good things, of returning to what hurts you, something shifts. A space opens up between the impulse and the action. A moment of choice appears where before there was only compulsion. And in that space, in that moment, everything becomes possible. This is what good therapy offers. Not a quick fix, not a way to erase the past, but a relationship in which these patterns can become visible, can be examined, can be understood with compassion rather than judgment. In the safety of the therapeutic relationship, you can start to notice the parts of you that are terrified of change. You can start to hear what they're afraid of. You can start to help them understand that you've grown up, that the dangers they're protecting you from may no longer exist, that there might be other ways to feel safe. The internal family systems model offers a particularly useful way of working with this. In IFS, you don't try to defeat or eliminate the parts that keep you stuck. You don't fight the protector who picks fights when things get too close. You don't try to silence the critic who tells you you're worthless. Instead, you get curious about them. You ask them what they're afraid of. You try to understand what they're protecting. What usually emerges is something surprisingly tender. The aggressive part is terrified of being hurt again. The self-sabotaging part is convinced that success will lead to exposure and rejection. The part that returns to toxic relationships is trying to finally get the love it was denied in childhood. These parts aren't enemies. They're wounded children doing their best to keep you safe, using the only strategies they know. And beneath all these protective parts, according to Schwartz, there's what he calls the self, a core of calm, curiosity, compassion, and clarity that remains undamaged even by severe trauma. He identifies 8 qualities that characterize self-energy: curiosity, calm, confidence, compassion, creativity, clarity, courage, and connectedness. This self can relate to the wounded parts without being overwhelmed by them. It can offer them the understanding and reassurance they never received. It can help them see that the world has changed, that you've changed, that new strategies are possible. This is a fundamentally hopeful vision. It says that no matter how deep the wounding, there's something in you that wasn't wounded. No matter how strong the addiction to suffering, there's a part of you that wants something different. The path forward isn't about destroying the parts that keep you stuck. It's about helping them transform. It's about earning their trust so they can finally let go of the extreme roles they've been playing for so long. But transformation requires something difficult. It requires grieving. Because when you start to let go of familiar suffering, you're not just letting go of pain, you're letting go of the hope that the past could have been different. You're letting go of the dream that if you just try hard enough, stay long enough, hurt badly enough, you might finally get what you needed from the people who couldn't give it to you. You're accepting that the childhood you deserved isn't coming, that the love you needed then won't arrive now, at least not in the form you hoped for, that the person who hurt you may never understand what they did, may never apologize, may never change. This is devastating. It's a kind of death, the death of a hope you might have been carrying for decades. And yet, paradoxically, it's the only way out, because as long as you're holding on to the hope that the past can be fixed, as long as you're reenacting it, trying to get a different ending, you're still living in that past. You're still that child, waiting for something that isn't coming. You're still oriented toward what was, rather than what could be. Grief is what allows you to finally leave, to turn away from the impossible project of fixing what's already happened, to turn toward the present, where things actually can change. It doesn't mean forgetting. It doesn't mean forgiving, if you're not ready for that. It just means accepting what is, so you can start building what could be. This grief often comes in waves. You might think you've worked through it, that you've accepted the loss, and then something triggers it again. A song, a smell, a flash of memory, and suddenly you're back in the pain. This is normal. This is how grief works. It doesn't move in a straight line. It spirals, returning to the same places again and again, each time from a slightly different angle. And there's something else grief requires that can be particularly hard for people addicted to their own suffering. It requires letting yourself feel the pain fully, without doing anything with it, without using it to connect, without turning it into identity, without keeping it alive past its natural lifespan. Healthy grief moves through you and eventually passes. The grief that feeds addiction to suffering gets held onto, picked at, kept fresh. It becomes a possession rather than a process. Learning to grieve in a healthy way, to feel the pain, honor it, and then let it go, is itself a skill that many people were never taught. If you grew up in an environment where emotions were dangerous, where crying got you punished, where vulnerability was exploited, you may have learned to either suppress grief entirely or to wallow in it endlessly. The middle path, feeling it fully and then releasing it, requires a kind of emotional fluency that has to be developed. This is what recovery from the addiction to suffering looks like. Not a sudden transformation, not a life without pain, but a gradual, often halting movement towards something new. A growing capacity to tolerate good things without immediately bracing for them to be taken away. A slowly expanding belief that you might deserve them. An accumulation of experiences that challenge the old patterns, that teach the nervous system that peace isn't dangerous, that show the wounded parts that connection doesn't have to equal pain. It takes time. It takes patience with yourself and with the process. There will be setbacks. There will be moments when the old patterns feel irresistible, when the familiar suffering calls to you like home, like the only place you know how to be. That's not failure. That's just the nature of changing patterns that have been in place for decades. The path isn't straight, but as long as you keep walking it, as long as you keep noticing the patterns and choosing differently when you can, something shifts. And here's what nobody tells you about the other side. It can feel strange, unfamiliar, almost uncomfortable at first, because you've been calibrated for storm, and calm feels wrong, because you've defined yourself by your suffering, and without it, you're not sure who you are, because you've connected through pain, and you're not sure how to connect any other way. This is where many people get stuck. They come so close to breaking free, and then the strangeness of freedom scares them back into what they know. The healthy relationship feels boring compared to the drama they're used to. The stable job feels confining compared to the chaos they're familiar with. The absence of crisis feels like the absence of meaning, the absence of intensity, the absence of being fully alive. If you find yourself here, know that it's normal. Know that it doesn't mean there's something wrong with you, or that the healthy thing isn't actually right for you. Your nervous system is simply adjusting to a new baseline. Your identity is reshaping itself around a new center. It takes time for peace to feel as real as chaos once did. It takes time to learn that you can be fully alive without being in pain. And know this too, the goal isn't to eliminate suffering from your life. That's impossible, and it's not even desirable. Suffering is part of being human. It's how we grow, how we deepen, how we learn what matters. The goal isn't to escape pain. The goal is to stop choosing it unnecessarily, to stop arranging for it, to stop returning to it, because it's the only thing you know. The goal is to develop what psychologists call earned secure attachment, the capacity, even if you didn't have it in childhood, to form bonds that feel safe, to trust others without constant suspicion, to receive love without waiting for it to be snatched away. This is possible. Research shows that attachment styles, while formed early, can change throughout life. Corrective emotional experiences in therapy, in relationships, in community can literally rewire the brain's expectations of what connection should feel like. The goal is to build what Martin Seligman, after his work on learned helplessness, went on to study for the rest of his career: learned optimism, the capacity to interpret setbacks as temporary rather than permanent, as specific rather than pervasive, as external rather than a reflection of your deepest self. This too can be developed. The explanatory style that predisposes people to depression and helplessness can be changed through consistent practice in challenging negative thoughts and attributations. The goal is to discover who you are beyond your wounds, because you are not what happened to you. You are not the child who was hurt or neglected or frightened. You are not the adult who keeps recreating those patterns. These are parts of your story, but they are not the whole of you. Beneath the pain, beneath the protection, beneath the patterns, there is something else, something that has been waiting all along for you to finally see it. And when you do, when you catch a glimpse of who you might be without the addiction to your own suffering, something remarkable can happen. The energy that went into maintaining the pain, reenacting the trauma, keeping the wounds fresh, that energy becomes available for something else, for building rather than destroying, for moving toward rather than retreating from, for creating a life that reflects what you actually want, rather than endlessly responding to what you fear. This is what freedom looks like, not the absence of difficulty, not a life without loss or disappointment or pain, but a life in which you're no longer the author of your own imprisonment, a life in which suffering, when it comes, is something that happens to you rather than something you unconsciously arrange, a life in which you can finally stop fighting old battles and start walking towards something new. You didn't choose your original wounds. You didn't ask for the patterns that formed around them. You weren't to blame for the way your nervous system learned to expect pain, or the way your identity wrapped itself around suffering, or the way your deepest beliefs told you that you deserved what hurt you. You were a child. You had no choice. You did what you had to do to survive, but you can choose what happens now. You can choose to see the patterns. You can choose to understand them with compassion rather than judgment. You can choose to get help, to find a therapist, to read the research, to talk to others who've walked this road. You can choose, moment by moment, to notice when you're heading back toward familiar pain and to ask yourself, is this really what I want? Or is this just what I know? The strange addiction to your own suffering makes a terrible kind of sense once you understand where it comes from. The mind isn't betraying you when it returns to pain. It's doing what minds do, seeking the familiar, trying to master the unresolved, protecting itself the only way it knows how. There's nothing shameful in this. There's nothing broken about you. You're not weak for struggling with these patterns. You're human, but understanding isn't the same as accepting. And accepting the origins of the pattern isn't the same as being bound to the pattern forever. You were shaped by your past. You don't have to be imprisoned by it. The patterns are real, but so is neuroplasticity, the brain's capacity to change throughout life. The wounds are real, but so is healing. The addiction is real, but so is recovery. And somewhere inside you, beneath all the layers of protection, beneath all the familiar pain, beneath everything you've built to survive, there is something that wants to live. Really live. Not just manage, not just cope, not just get through, but flourish. Experience joy. Connect deeply. Create meaning. Love and be loved without always waiting for the blow. That part of you is worth fighting for. It's worth the discomfort of change, the grief of letting go, the strange vulnerability of becoming someone new. It's worth the risk of believing that things could be different, because they can be, because you deserve more than the pain you know, because familiar suffering is still suffering, and you don't have to keep choosing it. The road out is not straight, and it's not short, but it's there. It's always been there. And every time you choose something different, every time you notice the pattern and make a different choice, every time you let something good happen without waiting for it to be taken away, every time you believe, even for a moment, that you might deserve better, you're walking it, one step at a time, one choice at a time, toward a life that's yours to build rather than yours to endure. The suffering that felt like home doesn't have to be home forever. You can learn a new address. You can teach your nervous system what peace feels like. You can discover who you are beyond the wounds. It won't be easy, but it's possible. And you're worth it. That's not a platitude. That's the truth. It's the truth the wounded parts of you don't believe yet. The truth the protector parts are afraid to risk. The truth that might take years of work to finally feel real. But it's still the truth. And sometimes holding onto a truth you can't quite feel yet is the beginning of everything. So hold on to it. Even when the familiar pain calls you back. Even when changing feels harder than staying stuck. Even when you're not sure you believe it. Hold on to the possibility that there's a different way to live, a different way to love, a different way to be with yourself, and then take one small step in that direction. That's how it starts. That's how it always starts. There's a concept in developmental psychology that helps explain why these changes, though difficult, are genuinely possible. It's called neuroplasticity, the brain's ability to reorganize itself by forming new neural connections throughout life. For a long time, scientists believed that the brain was essentially fixed after childhood, that the patterns laid down early were permanent. But research over the past several decades has overturned this view completely. The brain is far more malleable than we once thought. Every experience you have creates or strengthens certain neural pathways. The patterns of suffering you learned in childhood are essentially well-worn paths in your brain, paths that are easy to travel because you've traveled them so many times. But new paths can be created with repetition, with intention, with the right kind of support. You can build new neural highways that lead somewhere different. This is what therapy is doing at the neurological level. When you have a corrective emotional experience, when you're met with acceptance where you expected rejection, with consistency where you expected chaos, with care where you expected abandonment, your brain is literally rewiring itself. It's learning that there are other possibilities. It's building new paths. This doesn't happen overnight. Neural pathways that have been reinforced for 20 or 30 or 40 years don't disappear just because you've had a few good experiences. The old paths remain. In moments of stress, in moments of emotional intensity, you'll still find yourself traveling them. But each time you notice you're on the old path and consciously choose a different direction, you're strengthening the new one. And over time, the new path becomes more accessible. It becomes easier to travel. Eventually, it might even become the default. This is the neuroscience of hope. It tells us that change is possible not just psychologically, but biologically. Your brain is not a fixed entity, doomed to repeat the same patterns forever. It's a living, changing organ that responds to your experiences and your choices. The past has shaped it, but the future can reshape it. But let's be honest about what this kind of change actually involves. It's not just about thinking differently. It's not just about deciding to be different. The changes we're talking about happen at the level of the body, at the level of the nervous system, at the level of automatic responses that are faster than thought. You can't think your way out of trauma. You can't reason with a nervous system that's been calibrated for danger. This is why traditional talk therapy, while valuable, often isn't enough on its own for people with deep-seated trauma. Talking about your childhood, gaining insight into your patterns, these are important. But insight doesn't automatically translate into change. You can understand perfectly well why you keep choosing partners who hurt you and still find yourself doing it again. What's needed is what Kolk and other trauma researchers call bottom-up processing. Approaches that work directly with the body and the nervous system, not just the thinking mind. This might include somatic therapies that help you become aware of bodily sensations and learn to regulate your physiological states. It might include movement practices like yoga or dance that help you reconnect with your body in safe ways. It might include EMDR, which uses bilateral stimulation to help the brain reprocess traumatic memories. It might include neurofeedback, which trains the brain to shift out of chronic hyperarousal or dissociation. The point is that healing from the addiction to suffering requires working with the whole self. The thinking mind, yes, but also the emotional brain, the body, the nervous system. It requires creating experiences, not just insights. It requires practicing new ways of being, not just understanding why the old ways developed. And it requires community, because human beings are fundamentally social creatures, and so much of our wounding happened in relationship. Healing happens in relationship too. This might be the relationship with a therapist. It might be the relationship with a partner who offers something different from what you've known. It might be the relationships in a support group where others understand what you're going through because they've been there themselves. The isolation that often accompanies suffering is itself part of the problem. When you believe you're fundamentally different, fundamentally broken, fundamentally unworthy, you hide. You present a false self to the world. You don't let anyone see the parts of you that you're ashamed of. And this hiding keeps the wounded parts exactly where they are, alone, unseen, convinced that they could never be accepted. One of the most healing things that can happen is to be truly seen in your pain and accepted anyway. To show someone the parts of yourself you think are most unlovable and have them meet you with compassion instead of judgment. To discover that connection is possible without performing, without achieving, without suffering. This is corrective emotional experience at its most powerful. It rewrites the story that says you're only lovable when you're in pain. This is also why the addiction to suffering, paradoxically, often gets worse in isolation. When you're alone with your patterns, with no one to offer a different experience, the patterns just keep reinforcing themselves. You think the same thoughts, feel the same feelings, make the same choices. The ruts get deeper, the neural pathways get more entrenched. But when you're in genuine relationship, the kind of relationship where you can be honest, where you're met with consistency and care, where there's room for all of you, including the wounded parts, something different becomes possible. You start to have experiences that contradict the old beliefs. You start to build new associations. You start to learn at the level of the body and the nervous system that safety and connection are possible. This is slow work. It's not glamorous. It doesn't happen in breakthrough moments, though there might be some of those along the way. Mostly it happens through accumulation, through the steady deposit of new experiences that gradually build into a new foundation. It happens through the daily practice of noticing the old patterns and choosing something different, It happens through the courage to stay in relationships even when the urge to sabotage them is strong. And it happens through self-compassion. This might be the most important ingredient of all, because the voice that tells you that you deserve to suffer, that you're fundamentally broken, that change isn't possible for someone like you, that voice needs to be met with something other than more criticism. It needs to be met with understanding, with kindness, with the recognition that you've been doing the best you could with what you had. The concept of self-compassion, as developed by researcher Kristin Neff, involves three components. First, self-kindness rather than self-judgment, treating yourself with the same warmth and understanding you would offer a good friend. Second, common humanity rather than isolation, recognizing that suffering and imperfection are part of the shared human experience, not evidence of your unique brokenness. And third, mindfulness rather than over-identification, holding your painful thoughts and feelings in balanced awareness rather than being swept away by them. For people addicted to their own suffering, self-compassion can feel foreign, even threatening. If you've built your identity around being the one who has it hardest, being kind to yourself might feel like letting yourself off the hook. If you've internalized the belief that you deserve punishment, self-compassion might feel like cheating. If you've learned to connect through suffering, treating yourself well might feel like a kind of isolation. But self-compassion isn't about denying your pain or pretending everything is fine. It's about meeting your pain with kindness rather than adding more pain on top of it. It's about recognizing that the parts of you that are stuck in suffering are doing their best to protect you, even if their methods are outdated. It's about offering yourself the acceptance you've been seeking from others. Research shows that self-compassion is associated with greater emotional resilience, lower anxiety and depression, and better ability to cope with difficult life events. It's not a luxury or a form of self-indulgence. It's a crucial ingredient in healing. And for many people, learning to treat themselves with compassion is the most radical and difficult change they can make. So here's where we end up. The strange addiction to your own suffering is real. It has deep roots in psychology, in neuroscience, in the way early experiences shape us. It makes a terrible kind of sense when you understand it. But it's not inevitable. It's not permanent. It's not who you are at the deepest level. Beneath the patterns, beneath the wounds, beneath everything you've built to survive, there's something else. There's a self that was never damaged. There's a capacity for joy and connection and meaning that hasn't been destroyed, only buried. There's a version of you that isn't defined by suffering, that doesn't need pain to feel real, that can tolerate good things happening without waiting for them to be taken away. Finding that self, freeing that self, learning to live from that self. This is the work. It takes time. It takes support. It takes courage. And it takes a willingness to let go of what's familiar, even when what's familiar is all you've ever known. The suffering you've known has served a purpose. It's kept you connected to your past. It's given you an identity. It's protected you from the terror of the unknown. Honor that. Those patterns developed for good reasons. They helped you survive. But you're not just surviving anymore. You're here, reading this, thinking about these things. Something in you is ready for something different. Something in you knows that there's more to life than the pain you've known. Something in you wants to live, really live, in a way that doesn't require constant suffering. Trust that something. Listen to it. Let it guide you, one small step at a time, toward a life you don't have to recover from. The road is long. The work is hard, but you don't have to walk it alone. And every step you take, however small, is a step toward freedom. You've already started. Just by being here, just by seeing these patterns, just by daring to imagine that things could be different. Now keep going. One step, one choice, one moment of choosing something new instead of something familiar. That's all it takes. That's all it ever takes. And that's enough.